Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, Rover was back from the dead. The 1993 Rover 600 was a well-made car with some great styling that some motoring journalists were comparing favourably to the BMW 3 Series. And the Rover 200, 400 and 800 weren't doing too bad either. They would soon be joined by the MGF, a mid-engined roadster that was one of the few cars to give the Mazda MX-5 a run for its money. Long gone were the them and us adversarial days of the 1970s, Rover's workers were marching to the same beat and beating their rivals. 7 years later, Rover was in crisis mode with no money to develop new cars. The Rover 600 had ended production 3 years early. Where did the 600 come from, and why did its star fade so soon? This is the Rover 600 story. At the beginning of the 1980s, British Leyland was in all kinds of trouble. It was having to launch lackluster products like the Ital and the Ambassador, or Embarrasser as some BL people called it. These were refreshes of 1970s cars that couldn't be fully redeveloped due to a lack of cash. Clearly, BL needed a way to fill out its range with new quality cars. The result was a collaboration with Honda. BL got new models for little to no investment, and the Japanese car maker got better access to the European car market, especially important with looming import quotas. The first fruits of the deal was a Triumph Acclaim, a lightly reworked Honda Ballade. The collaboration flourished with its replacement, the Rover 200 and Rover 800, which was a true collaboration between the two companies. The 1989 Rover 200 was a big hit, combining the solid mechanicals from Honda with British styling both inside and out. Collaboration had allowed the British carmaker to invest in the well-received K-Series engine. It was all coming up roses for British Leyland, now renamed Rover. The mid-80s Austin Montego needed a replacement. First thoughts were to lengthen and reskin the existing car with a look similar to the Rover 800 as a saloon estate and a hatchback to allow it to compete with the Sierra and the Cavalier. But Rover didn't have the money to keep the Montego platform relevant, and the idea slowly died a death. At the end of the 1980s, Honda came calling, suggesting Rover produce a version of their big seller, the Honda Accord. To Rover, this made perfect sense, especially after the success of the Rover 200. Honda also saw it as a good deal. They got extra revenue from an existing model and free insight into European car design. The Accord was much larger than the Montego. It was bigger even than the Sierra and Cavalier, being more the size of a Volkswagen Passat or Ford Granada. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It was hard to compete toe-to-toe with the Sierra and Cavalier with their razor-thin margins. The Honda deal came with restrictions, of course. Firstly, Rover couldn't change the exterior of the new European version of the Accord, except for cosmetic changes. That wasn't much of a problem. Rover had shown their talent in using small changes to rework the 200 into a car that looked nothing like a Honda, with a class-leading interior. Honda had two other conditions. Rover had to use Honda engines, and the car couldn't be sold in the USA. That last proviso wasn't too hard to concede either. By 1989, it was clear Rover's latest foray into the North American market with the Sterling was failing. In any case, Rover's focus was the European market. Although Rover couldn't change the outside, that didn't mean that they couldn't influence what the next Honda Accord would look like. Honda and Rover worked into the wee hours to create a shape that would fit both companies' visions, and given how disparate they were, that wasn't a trivial task. And some of those conditions that Honda had put in place were already slipping. By the end of the design work, Rover had been given free rein to change some of the body panels to make the car their own. In the end, almost all the panels were reworked in some fashion except for the front doors. By picking their battles and with hard work, Rover came back from Japan with a shape that was amazingly close to the original sketch of what they wanted to produce. The Rover look got an upgrade, growing a grille reminiscent of Rovers of yore like the P5, and this could be seen as the start of Rover's phase of plumbing the depths of nostalgia that would culminate in the Rover 75. Part of this inspiration came from the poor reception the 800 have received in North America as the Sterling. It didn't seem to have the sort of British look that customers found on cars like the Jaguar XJ, for example, or indeed on luxury cars from Germany. The public got to see the new Rover grille on the 800 refresh in 1991, but it all began with sketches for the smaller Rover in 1989. Along with the P5 inspired grille were other luxury and nostalgic touches that were becoming less common, such as chrome detail. Unlike the Rover 200, Honda will be responsible for designing the interior of both cars, using lessons learned from Rover. The British car maker's changes were relegated to not much more than slapping a Rover badge on the steering wheel. Rover tested the new car at customer clinics and got just the response that they were looking for. Like the Rover 200, this was seen as an understated, classy saloon. This was a desirable Rover. It was time to put it into production. The Rover 600 launched in April 1993. There were no doubts what this car really was. It had already launched as the Honda Ascot Innova in Japan and would soon launch as the European Honda Accord. And this was one of the problems with Rover's strategy of building badge-engineered Hondas. Why not just buy a Honda? Rover's advantage, though, was in its image. This was the company that offered the luxury 800, and then there was that Rover grille. People in the customer clinics thought it added £2,000 to the price of the car. That was handy, as it cost about £2,000 more than the Accord, but it meant that the grille and the badge were doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Was Rover just being too greedy? Well, with all the fees that Rover had to pay to Honda, it may not have had much of a choice. It's been suggested it cost Rover £1,000 more to use a Honda engine over a similar Rover unit. But Rover had one more trick up its sleeve: widespread access to the UK fleet market, and this is where Rover could sell it against the BMW 3 Series. That might seem a tall order, but car journalists of the day said the 600, with great handling and a good spec level, bested a similarly priced entry-level 3 Series, as well as the gear trim level of the all-conquering newly launched Ford Mondeo. Whilst British Leyland had never had an answer to the Cortina and the Sierra, with Honda's help, they were finally competing with the best. There was a choice between a 2-litre and a few months later a 2.3-litre engine, both from Honda of course, and allied to a manual or an automatic. None of them could set the world on fire, but then they weren't slouches either. They were aimed at the middle of the market and delivered a perfectly pleasant experience for most people, which, if you want to sell a lot of cars, is what you should be going for after all. What people didn't like, though, was the entry-level 600 with black bumpers, which was designed to make it look as ugly as possible and push customers to the more expensive models. What's more, it worked. Upmarket models came with ABS, leather seats, a CD changer and air conditioning, all the mod cons a modern Rover should offer. Above all, it's a Rover, as we were being constantly reminded. But above all, wasn't it really a Honda? The launch of the 600 showed just how much Rover's range relied on the Japanese car maker. At the entry level, they were selling the Rover 100, the old Metro that by now was 13 years old and seriously in need of an update. Or you could buy an even older 1950s Mini, which by now was being sold as a classic car. Rover still offered the Maestro and Montego, but both were out of date and not long for this world. The only new modern cars Rover had on offer were Hondas, the 200, 400, 800 and now the 600. Rover would soon launch the MGF, but this wasn't intended as a high-volume car, and to be fair, Rover were trying to replace the 100 with the home-built, sort of, Rover 200 in 1995. But on the whole, Rover was utterly dependent on Honda, and needed the Japanese car maker a lot more than Honda needed Rover. With such a close relationship between Honda and Rover, there was speculation that Honda would take some sort of stake in the company. It was therefore a shock when Rover was sold to BMW at the start of 1994. This made the existing Honda involvement a tricky situation to deal with, especially the newly launched 600 that would normally have an 8-year product cycle. The agreement hadn't given Rover the ability to develop the 600 platform, and this meant it was a dead end for BMW. A replacement would need to be developed. After the BMW deal, Rover renegotiated the Honda engine agreement for the 600. It would finally use the cheaper Rover T-Series petrol engine. This let Rover off the leash somewhat, producing the sporty 197 horsepower 620 Ti with a 0 to 60 time around 7 seconds. Fitting a Rover engine in a Honda Accord, though, wasn't a trivial task. Honda engines rotated in the opposite direction to Rover's, which involved major rework. It was worth the effort, though. It helped expand the range to woo more customers and lower production costs. 1994 and 1995 saw a bump in sales, this despite BMW not being keen on the sporty 620 Ti. Their vision for Rover was laid-back motoring. They might have been right though. The 620 Ti might be fast, but some reviewers found it wanting when it had to negotiate a bend. Rover's engine team launched a banging new engine, a direct injection turbo diesel. It had power and fuel economy, and it got its first outing in the Rover 600. Honda liked it so much they offered it in the Civic and Accord. It boosted Rover 600 sales in diesel-friendly markets such as France and Italy. Under BMW ownership, the 600 was never going to get much love, especially with a replacement under development. The car got minor updates in 1996 and 97, such as a smaller 1.8 litre Honda engine, more exterior paint colours and lowered suspension. But on the whole, the car was largely ignored. Fleet customers had bought the 600, but ironically, by the time BMW had bought Rover, it was the German brand that looked more prestigious on your driveway. A cascade of Rover 600 lease cars dropped on the used car market and resale values tanked. Rover tried to hide the problem by storing used 600s on an airfield to prop up resale values, all without BMW's knowledge. This was another case of Rover's awful accounting. Companies shouldn't hold this level of depreciating assets on their balance sheet. Munich wasn't happy, and this contributed to BMW's decision to ditch Rover. With the announcement of the new Rover 75 at the end of 1998, 600 production ended quietly in January 1999. When the 800 also ended production, so went most of the last vestiges of the Honda collaboration that had looked so strong just 5 years earlier. The Rover 75 was announced with pomp and ceremony, but with Rover's balance sheet bleeding red, BMW paid the future owners to take Rover off their hands in 2000. Normally, vehicle parts are available for 10 years after a car ends production, but the newly independent and cash-strapped MG Rover had no money for niceties like this. Honda Accord parts could be substituted, of course, but not for things like body panels, and this led to the scrapping of many 600s before their time. If you looked at the convoluted timeline of mid-sized saloons from the company that became Rover, it shows the convulsions the company went through. The 1970s Marina was a stopgap with 1940s Morris Minor heritage underneath the skin. It continued for way too long because BL went bankrupt in the mid-70s. It was replaced by the 1980s Montego, funded by you and me, and we were never repaid our investment. That led to a decision to stop throwing good money after bad, and Rover was privatised. An inability to finance the new model produced a Honda collaboration that delivered the Rover 600. Then finally, the Rover 75, a great car built at considerable BMW expense and given to a company cut adrift with no money to speak of. After MG Rover's bankruptcy, it would eventually get built by its new owners in China. But let's rewind to 1989 when the 600 was being developed and imagine an alternate future where Honda decided that they wanted to get into the European luxury market, like they were doing with Acura in the US, and so bought a minority stake in Rover, maybe with the option of buying a controlling stake in the future. Instead of expanding Honda manufacturing in Swindon, let's say that they modernised or rebuilt Rover's factories in Cowley and Longbridge, bringing in new tooling from Japan. The 200, 400, 600 and 800 could all be produced at these new factories to Honda tolerances and under one roof rather than splitting production between Cowley and Swindon like Rover and Honda were doing with the 600 and the Accord. Rover's design centre could continue to refine Honda cars for Europe, as they had already shown they were very capable of doing. Rather than Honda cars fighting against Rover, a combined marketing budget could have been put to better use, and Rover wouldn't have one hand tied behind its back, having to pay expensive royalties. Honda felt that their cars were more premium than the market was giving them credit. With a ready-built luxury brand and some leather bling, they would finally prove it, slowly moving up market to become a luxury class leader. The Metro would be ditched and customers directed to purchasing a new Honda Civic. Rover's dealer network would supercharge Honda's inroads into the European market, and Rover workers would get long-term employment, like Nissan's workers would experience in Sunderland. There are problems with this utopian vision, of course. Honda was spending a lot of money readying their North American Acura luxury brand and would soon feel the economic winter of the Japanese lost decade starting in 1990. All of that could have slowed down more investment in Rover and the European market. But anything would have been better than what we got instead, the BMW deal, where mistakes were made on both sides. Quite why the 600 wasn't replaced with a restyled 3 Series is beyond me. It would have cost a fraction of the price, and Rover had already shown that they could take an existing car and turn it into something very different on a small budget. Instead, Rover burnt through cash reinventing the wheel with the Rover 75, money that should have been spent on small cars that weren't in BMW's range, like they did with the highly successful Mini. The Rover 600 was a great car that was delivered a death blow with the BMW takeover announcement just as sales were getting started. Almost the same happened to its replacement, the Rover 75, with BMW's abandonment. But the Rover 600 showed what a successful Rover under Honda could have looked like. And although it's been largely forgotten today, the 600 should be celebrated as one of the best cars that Rover ever produced. If you want to see what happened next, there's a video on the Rover 75 on the right. Thanks for watching to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.